all my adult life I've had an interest in internationalist work and perspectives. So that's one element. The other is that I was teaching in a college, and my family moved to California, and at that point I couldn't get a teaching job. And in the meanwhile, Lebanon was invaded by Israel and the U.S. And people at the university where I am, the University of California at Santa Barbara, knew that I was of Lebanese descent, and so they asked me to appear on a radio show to talk about Lebanon and what was happening there. And so I was bitten by the bug, you might say, after that experience. And I began reporting because the information that was coming from the corporate media was so abysmal that I knew that there were other stories to be told. And I guess that's what I see community radio doing, is telling the stories that are obliterated in other places and that need to be remembered. I was going through file cabinets and I came across a newsletter that had been produced by the AMARC office in Montreal, and I looked at it and there were stories about these radio stations that were just functioning in the most incredible ways. And that, with my interest in international issues and in what we certainly called then the Third World, and I think it still has currency as a concept, it made it very inviting to me. So I started following a little bit what was happening with AMARC. And in 1992, there was a conference held in Huastepec, Mexico, which was close enough to me in Southern California that I could conceive of going there. And so I took some vacation time and I took some of my own money and so on, and went to Huastepec to the General Assembly, which I believe was AMARC 5. And at that point, just became involved partly in the women's work, partly in the regional work for North America, and eventually came away from that meeting as the deputy to the vice president. And the vice president that the region elected to stand was Barbara Lozier from Polkmosh, Canada. And so she and I began working together, and not a lot to begin with, but more and more as time went on. And then in 1998, I became part of the board. In the meanwhile, I'd gone to the Commission on the Status of Women meetings at the United Nations, where the first year we had no official recognition, but the second year the non-governmental organizations were given a voice there. So, and AMARC became, I think we had observer status by the end of those meetings. Community radio in North America, particularly in the US and Canada, is very strong in some ways. But when I became an employee in community radio, it was for me at a low moment in that work. There was a push to become more businesslike, to do programming that would raise funds rather than programming that needed to be done. And so when I went to Huastepec and I met these amazing people who were clandestinely operating radios, or who were doing it with a little portable transmitter of some sort, etc., or who were demanding that the sector be recognized in their own countries, it was revitalizing for me. It made me think, now this is the community radio that I wanted to get involved in, not this other stuff that could have been done by people with masters in business administration. And that was what I brought back to the national organizations in the US. I began doing that, to say, you have to understand what's out there, what you're not seeing or hearing or thinking about. And many of our radios were becoming jukeboxes,
Playing only music.
playing only music. And in the case of my station, there were attempts to push community people out so that only students would do only indie rock, and that had to be resisted. So having other models of the pedagogical importance, the political and health benefits was extraordinarily important. Corporate and state-owned media can change things, and mostly not for the good. In the 30 years or so, when the corporate ownership of media has been consolidated,
And
stronger and stronger, the transfer of wealth from ordinary people to the very, very few, very, very wealthy has been overwhelming. And that's in part because of the way we are given information, and by the way we're not given information. So that on the one hand we're fed certain kinds of ideas, etc., that we are expected to believe as the truth from governments, from corporations, etc. As an example, right now all of the petroleum outfits are claiming to be green, the way that happens, and on the other hand, the way we are disinformed and misinformed by corporate media, so that we are led to believe that someone pretending to be surviving on an island somewhere is good television, when there are really people on islands who are in mortal danger. That kind of misinformation is happening all the time. So I know that it has an impact. It just, because we consume it like candy. So I have to believe the obverse is also true, that if misinformation can win the day, then good information and communication can win the day. That if we let people talk about what their concerns are, they're going to tell us it's not whether somebody pretends to survive on an island. It's that their children are getting bad education, that they're eating food that is contaminated, that, any number of things. We can begin to not only change people's attitudes, because sometimes the proper attitude is there's just no way of expressing it. But we can do that, but we can also represent a better and a different reality. When I talk to people about, particularly students whom I work with, they say, why do you do this? And I say, well, I'm not Rupert Murdoch, and I don't have those capacities, and I never will. But what I can do is light a spark sometime. That may smolder for years, and then at some point there might be an opening and somebody will say, well, you remember, maybe we should do something this way rather than that way. So even in the worst of the Bush years, you could be giving people alternative ways of viewing the world. And I think that's part of what we do. Radio is pretty universally accessible. It's ubiquitous, certainly outside of the global north. Okay, so that's one reason. But I think as well, there's something different happens when you listen to something with someone than when you listen to something or read something in isolation. And that's what, in part, although I use the internet intensively, that is part of what concerns me about internet. And about other technologies like cell phones. My husband and I have a common number at our house. Now people are not having that collective identity. Okay, now I have a number, you have a number, they have numbers, right? And there is it's an atomizing moment in many ways. So, for example, with students whom I talk with, who now, many of them only consume things from the internet or through their computers, I think it's depressing for them sometimes. I think they get information, but they don't engage in necessarily in what they can do about it. You know, you walk through a room and there's a radio playing, and you're not the only one who's hearing it. Anybody else that's in the room is hearing it. And so, you know, we both hear something, and I say, "Wait, did you hear that?" You know, and you say, "Yeah, that's crazy," right? And we begin a conversation. And even when we share things sometimes on the internet, I have lots of people who send me things. They're clever sometimes and funny or tragic or whatever. I receive it by myself usually. Occasionally someone will come in and say, "Go to this website, check this out," and we'll watch it together. And in some ways it's that social connection where we share a moment, an idea that I think is really something that radio does better than anything else still. This is an organization that I love, that I've had the privilege of traveling all over the world to be part of it and to know people that are just like amazing. I'm struck sometimes by I'm talking to somebody and they're just somebody, you know, we're just having coffee together or whatever. And then I find out that there was a fatwa against this woman who I've been just talking about, you know, and not knowing that there was an international movement around her. So, you know, and I can name lots of those stories. And we come together and we struggle with language and we struggle over political issues because we don't all agree, and it's wonderful. So I'm getting very melancholy at this point in the meetings because I am stepping down, but I'll stay involved. I will stay involved, and I will gladly participate in committee work or in delegations if we have, if in response to rights violations, etc. I'm at AMARC's service.
I think people like you in AMARC. That's what I heard. Thank you very much.
Yeah.